Hello and welcome to Fintech Insider Insights. I'm Kate Moody. In today's episode, we're asking, are financial services equipped to serve digital nomads? It's estimated that there are some 35 million people worldwide who packed in the office in the 9 to 5 hours in favour of a life of travel and working from across the world armed with a laptop. But while this lifestyle has boomed post-pandemic, financial services is still looking to play catch-up when it comes to wages, taxes, compliance and payments. So, we've put together a panel of experts to discuss what options are there for digital nomads today, what are the biggest hurdles still to overcome, and how do financial services aimed at digital nomads need to evolve going forwards. We'll discuss all this and more in today's show. But first, a few brief messages. Don't go anywhere.
Hello and welcome,
LFG people,
to Fintech Insider,
Blockchain Insider, 11FS Spotlight,
11FS Explores,
Open Mic Night,
After Dark. Through our podcasts, videos, newsletters, and live events, we have a direct line to a truly global fintech community. So if you're looking to sponsor and collaborate on content that connects with everybody from fintech beginners to the biggest VCs, then chat to our team at sponsors@11fs.com or visit 11fs.com to find out more.
Long live the community.
Awesome, let's get started. As always, I'm joined by a panel of amazing guests who can shed some light on this super interesting topic. First off, we have a Fintech Insider debut for Devin Kohli, co-head at Outward VC. Welcome to the show, Devin. Can you give our audience an introduction to you and your role at Outward, please?
Yeah, hi, and thanks for having me. So I'm general partner at Outward VC. We're an early stage fintech fund focused on the late seed stage and backing companies into A and B rounds. Our LPs include Investec, Blackstone, and a number of other institutions and family offices. We are shortly to launch Fund 2, having invested in the likes of Curve, Monet, Bud, Primary Bid, Pepe in Fund 1.
What a brilliant collection. Well, looking forward very much to hearing your perspective, so thank you very much for joining us. We also have a Fintech Insider debut for Chris Cerra, creator at RemoteBase. Chris, how are you doing? Can you give our listeners an introduction to you and your role at RemoteBase, please?
Hello, Kate. Hello, listeners. Great to be here. Yeah, sure. The remote work and travel lifestyle changed pretty much my entire life. So now my mission is to help others who want to start or continue on their own version of that journey. So RemoteBase delivers on that vision by being the independent voice of authority in what is a sea of digital nomad accommodation options. So we curate top listings available with incredible discounts, and we share them on a free email newsletter that goes out to thousands of members. A good way to think of this is like Jack's Flight Club for Airbnb.
Awesome. I do love Jack's Flight Club. So very excited to hear your take on the world of digital nomads. Thank you very much for joining us. And last, but by no means least, we have Domantas Valinskas, CEO at TransferGo. Great to have you here, Domantas. What can you tell our audience about TransferGo, please?
Well, thank you for having me. Happy to be here. So I'm co-founder and CEO at TransferGo, and TransferGo is a cross-border payments company for digital migrants. You call them nomads, we call them migrants, but at the end of the day, our mission is to make sure that they can move money instantly back home at a fraction of the cost. And broader speaking, we're also solving a problem of financial inclusion, because the world is not designed when you leave your home country.
Absolutely.
And we are working to design that. So we're today 5 million customers plus, growing at 90% last year in revenue. So there's a booming market out there across the board, and but it's still not solved by any means.
Absolutely not. Well, yeah, it sounds like a crazy busy time for you guys. So thank you for taking time to join us and looking forward to hearing your take on things. So thank you all for joining. Let's dive in. Let's start by looking at how the market for digital nomads looks today. Hopefully we can start with a simple question. How do we define digital nomads? Who's got a stab at this? Chris?
I can take a stab at this. So I actually like to look at this as like a spectrum. So you have people on the spectrum who go from completely local or remaining in their home country, and then you have people who take vacations or holidays, and then you have people who might go traveling for extended periods. Then you have people who go away and work online while they're away, the digital nomad or the traveling remote worker. And then kind of as you creep further down the spectrum, You have people who are quote unquote slow mads. So, they stay for a longer period of time, maybe up to 6 months, maybe a bit more than 6 months, which puts you into a whole world of tax mess. And then after that, you kind of end up in basically just expat land. So that's the other end of the spectrum, like full expat. So yeah, I think that's how I see the whole spectrum. And there's a really big chunk of it, which is like the digital nomad traveling remote worker. I think definitions like people who work online or people who can work online from anywhere fit the criteria. And it's just really about whether or not they take the label on themselves.
Interesting. Demantis, obviously you talked about using migrant as a term. Like, how would your perspective fit with what Chris explained, or do you see differences in your audience?
I would agree. I would also extend it to the economic nomad or economic migrant in a sense, because what we see is that people are living increasingly borderless lives. For them, they want to move money to individuals. They don't care or understand for countries. They want to be banked to be able to get access to financial services, without any borders. And this is not the world that we live in today. Now, there clearly are different use cases if you are working in Bali for 3 months, or if you are a seasonal worker in Central Eastern Europe, sending money back home. But the access problems probably are quite similar. So, and from the size perspective, from the impact perspective, the most underserved and the largest market, I would guess, would still probably be economic migrants. So that's what we are focusing on.
Absolutely. Devin, have you got anything to add from your VC perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Chris and Domantas. I mean, I feel that digital nomad often has a perception of choice around it, that I've chosen to go and live abroad and work there for a period of time, whether it's short or long. But there's a huge different spectrum there, which is the economic migrant people. The gig economy workers are a very good case in point here. People who move to another country to seek higher salary or higher form of pay, and then use that capital to try and send their money back home, wherever that may be in the world. And that's often overlooked when we talk about digital nomads and the catalyst of the pandemic and people going off to Portugal as freelancers or whatever it is. But there's a whole other wave of people who've actually had no choice but to move to another country to attain a higher income and send it back home. So I would answer the question by looking at it as those who have the choice and those who don't have the choice. And I think whether we call it economic migrant on one spectrum versus digital nomad on the other, maybe a decent starting point.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a really fascinating way of looking at it. And I suppose across both, that chosen nomadic lifestyle and that enforced nomadic lifestyle, how much has the last 2 years influenced that? I think there's been lots of talk about this boom, this move to a more technological workforce. Is it about technology? Is it about culture? Is it about other factors? What's driving this, Demantis, from your perspective?
Unfortunately, what we see is the more unstable the world is, the more migration is booming. And we see that the war in Ukraine has displaced not only 5 million Ukrainians, but it displaced millions of Russians who fled, displaced millions in CIS, Central Eastern Asia, that have left, and numerous other geographies that probably try to go either to Europe or to the US. And in those banking markets, they are complete and utter unknowns because the markets and the structure is not designed even to get access to a bank account, which is something that we all think has been resolved a long time ago. Actually, the reality is very different, because without having a simple proof of address for a refugee, which is pretty much impossible because you don't have address in Europe, you can't get access to benefits, you can't get access to being part of the financial world. So this is a very serious problem. And unfortunately, we live in probably least stable times for the last 50 years. So yeah, this is very real right now.
Absolutely. Chris, obviously you work directly with digital nomads in your role. I mean, my assumption is that they would be more typically in that sort of chosen lifestyle bracket. Is that fair? Like, what's the sort of typical economic work background for them?
Yeah, definitely more of a choice, or people choosing to pursue this lifestyle as a almost like a companies sell it as a perk or a benefit, like flexible working or the option or the ability to be able to work from anywhere. And yeah, people are choosing to pursue that. I think it maps to statistics that from people like Moneyzine and Flatio, where our members are like 40% self-employed, about 45% employed by companies. More than 20% of them earn over 80K. There's about 10% of them that earn over 120K. So they're definitely they have financial backing. They're working in roles that are well-paid roles. They're like half of our audience covers IT or development, marketing, growth, partnerships, that kind of commercial stuff, or internally in HR or ops or finance. So yeah, there's a broad spread, but they are in that category of higher earning roles. And so yeah, there's some jobs that you just can't do remotely, right? There's some jobs that you need to be in a certain location for, and if you're doing that, then you can't choose to take that role on the road. The only other way to do it is to, I think, as you said, Devin, move not out of choice, but by almost like you're forced to move, and kind of pursue opportunities somewhere else. So yeah, I think, I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, absolutely. I think we could probably do like a whole show on people like that have been forced to move and forced to relocate. So there's a huge wealth of stuff to unpack there. I suppose I'm interested, but for those individuals that do choose to move, Devin, what are some of the key financial decisions that you think those people are having to make when they are committing to that lifestyle by choice?
Yeah, on the assumption that they're choosing to do this, I think obviously they're looking at the ease of not only the logistics, travel, accommodation, etc., but the practicalities then of earning in a different country, whether it's how long are they there for, taxation, compliance, what role are they performing outside of their home country? Is there a compliance and regulatory issue there? Bank account ease, currency exchange, is it themselves or is it their families or dependents that they're moving? All these things are obvious things that people think of. And a lot of it is also dictated by duration. Like, am I going there for a set period of time? You had a wave of people escape the UK, for example, who were fortunate, able to during the pandemic, and pack up and live somewhere else for a bit. And often they were by themselves. Often they were able to do that and relatively young in highly paid jobs. So many of them are back in the UK now. So there are, I think those are the main things for people who have the choice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Domantas, obviously we've seen a rise in e-residencies, countries offering particular visas to these types of digital nomads. How successful do you think those e-residencies or visas have been?
Well, we see probably different degrees of success across the board. We see tax migrants, tax nomads that are going for and getting their residencies for tax reasons. We're seeing lifestyle. So I think that the tax ones are probably the trickiest ones, I would say, because I think that it's still quite a bit of unclarity when it comes to how do you manage your taxes abroad. Personally, I'm dealing, and I see a lot of people dealing with that. When it comes to being employed, 11% of our staff is contractors, and they work everywhere. So we have an entire subset of our people team dedicated to make sure that their experience is measured. We have various companies that we employ across the board to manage their process, so that make sure that they are comfortable from a tax standpoint, etc. So this has changed after the pandemic and during pandemic, and I think there is a whole new market that we've seen sprung up just to manage this new reality, for sure. And there's still a lot of gray areas and unknowns, to be honest.
Yeah, it's hugely complex. Devin, are you seeing more financial players looking to court this audience? Are you seeing digital nomads being mentioned in pitch decks more often? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think we had a wave particularly during the pandemic. In the beginning of the pandemic, you had a number of companies setting up to address this, or you had different companies that already existed, sort of focusing less on economic migrants and more on digital nomads, or actually referring to them as digital nomads. You've had companies in the sort of compliance payroll space or for remote workers like Deal, which have really pushed through during the pandemic and over the last couple of years. So there's been a wave of capital going in, driven by people, or the view that this would be a more long-term play, that digital nomads would be here for good, and the luxury of choice would be around and we'd be able to try and solve hurdles like tax, like compliance, like labor law, employment law, as a means, and so you're seeing that happen. So I think, as I say, going back to what I said at the beginning, there was that, and then you've also seen, as there has been for a while, companies, and one in our portfolio like Monets, which are focused on economic migrants, and those who perhaps don't have that choice and have come here and looking to just make their life easier with a bank account.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a good opportunity for us to switch to focus maybe on some of those challenges that you've zoomed in on. So, what challenges are there still to be solved for digital nomads? Chris, from what you see with your customers, what are some of the biggest pain points that are preventing this from being a seamless experience for these individuals?
I think there's responsibility on both sides. I feel like you can kind of slice this 4 different ways. There's like individuals and companies, and then in the individuals bucket, you've got people who are self-employed or work for themselves, have their own company, or there's employees. And then on the company side, I guess the company side is its own. So maybe it's just three buckets, not 4. And their job is like make it as seamless as possible for people to, if they want to pursue this lifestyle. Like Devin's just talked about Deal, like a huge employee of record company, and like these companies just like seem to sprout up out of nowhere over the course of the pandemic. Although some of them obviously existed before, and I think the challenges are different depending on where you sit. Probably the biggest one is tax, because I don't feel like organizations like the actual tax authorities, globally tax authorities, I don't think are equipped enough to be able to catch people who are, let's say, trying to find their way out of paying tax. I don't think people are fundamentally against paying tax somewhere, but there isn't really an easy way for them to do it, or an easy way for people to know how or where. Companies have it slightly easier, right? Because the employee of record companies are kind of set up to do that, and Demantis talks about the infrastructure there that's built for companies to enable that and to give people opportunities. But on the individual side, it's still really, really difficult. So I think as digital nomads, people who are pursuing this lifestyle, if their company isn't set up in the proper way, I think it's almost like this gray cloud that just sits over you, in terms of how do I now go about making sure that I'm compliant? People aren't necessarily looking to evade things, but I'm sure that's happening just by consequence of there not being proper methods for people.
For sure. I mean, Demantis, as Chris said, you touched on tax being an issue that you see. How much of a minefield is it? Where are the main problems at the moment?
Well, taxation is only one of the issues that we see. And this is more on the affluent side, I would say. And there's ways how to manage that. But I would also touch upon a couple of other structural problems in financial services that exist today that prevent access to banking, and prevent access to credit. So on a banking side, I think I would point to, especially in Europe, that there's a huge fragmentation of local IBAN infrastructure. And what that means is that banks are still dominating through regulation ownership of local IBANs, which means that in certain parts of Europe, you can only get banked with a bank. Means you can only get a bank account that can deposit, then you can deposit your salary if you are being banked with a traditional institution. And even though the regulation should allow for non-banks to offer that easily, you still need a bank sponsor in many respects. So there is that, which is access, and this is, I think, should be very universal for both nomads and economic migrants. It's access issue. And secondly, this is a bigger problem, much more difficult to solve, but it's that need for international credit scoring and international credit house. Right, because right now, if you would like to offer these people who need the credit the most, you would need to collect credit from one country and create defaults from another, or collect the defaults from another. This doesn't happen. And that's why people who are in the need for that, they are pretty much underserved, because everybody is treated as high risk if you enter a new country. And it's the same for nomads or for migrants, even more important for migrants. So I would say that international credit scoring and the need to set that up is hugely important, and no one's really cracked it yet.
Yeah, we've had a couple of guests, I think, on the show. There are definitely some fintechs that are starting to look at that. But as you say, it is a huge problem and definitely something that needs to accelerate and roll out faster. Devin, obviously there's lots of issues in this space, so I think we could spend a lot of time on it. And one thing we've not touched on, I suppose, explicitly is payments. So what payments problems do you see, or do your potential portfolio companies talk about, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think tax and access aside, I think like payments, obviously you've got currency risk, you've got the ability to onboard. I mean, in order to make a payment, you've got to be onboarded. In order to be onboarded, you've got to have an account somewhere, and it's often not, if you're working in X but paying predominantly to your back to Y, a different country, then it's easy to get the bank account in X, and getting that access is not easy for a digital nomad, and even less so for an economic migrant. So, onboarding procedures for companies, some companies even in Europe struggle to onboard small freelance businesses. They just can't do it. And then, so setting up the account in its first place is difficult. Then making international payments through those banks can sometimes be challenging. And you're also then taking FX risk. So I think those three aspects in terms of, probably contribute to making payments quite challenging. You then also impact that with what type of payments then goes back to the tax point, because they may be flouting certain tax laws. And to Chris's point, I don't think people deliberately intend to, but as we all know, tax policy is deliberately opaque. And it always will be, because that's how governments operate. And I think having tax harmonization even within the EU is proving to be a challenge, let alone globally. So I think the only people who really win out of this are accountants, and they're able to assist you through certain phases, but that's really meant for the more affluent digital nomad. So I think payments, not just the rails and the onboarding and the facilitation and the actual, if it is in fiat currency and in FX risk, all of this is these are problems which have been slightly addressed and are being addressed, and they're much better than they were 5-7 years ago, but I think they can all be finessed in a far better way.
Interesting. I agree, absolutely. Chris, I think there's a bit of a halo around this idea of digital nomad. Sometimes people see it as this very luxurious lifestyle of choice and freedom, but are there actually sort of hidden costs and expenses that add up for these people that we're not mindful of in the way that we should be?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Kate. I really appreciate the recognition of the halo there. No, I think this is two sides of the same coin, because yes, there might be some hidden costs, but actually one of the things that this lifestyle promotes is like a minimalist lifestyle, like a lifestyle with less dependence on material possessions, less dependence on stuff, and less dependence on crap. Like, there is so much stuff that you give up without really realizing that you give it up. And I think one of the things that you hit on is the fact that whilst there's a lot of glossy content that shows this lifestyle as being, glamorous or luxurious or whatever, and idyllic, like actually there's things that people have to pass on to make this lifestyle work. Whether that's, having a fancy car that's a status symbol, or whether that's like having a pet because it's really impractical to travel with pets. Stuff like that is like stuff that people forgo that maybe they would really like in their life that doesn't really fit with the travel lifestyle. It's almost like you choose the experience of traveling and exposure to different cultures and different people and different languages in different places. You choose that over all of the other stuff. And this doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a long period of time. Like, many people will kind of like sell everything. I see this all the time where people say like, I sold everything and now I'm a digital nomad. And I don't necessarily think it works that way. I think more realistic is slowly but surely you kind of leave a bunch of stuff at home, and then you go travel for a little bit. And when you come back, you realize that you're not really dependent on this stuff. You just have it because it was marketed to you and you don't really need it. So you either get rid of it or, you give it to somebody else, you sell it, whatever. But slowly over time, you untether yourself. And so that balances out all of the additional costs that 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 you might be alluding to. I don't know what, like, the additional costs. It's a really tough one. It depends where you are. Like, there's a lot of talk about geo arbitrage here, and like going to places where you can basically live for less money, or have the same stuff for less. So yeah, hidden costs is not really something that I think is a huge problem.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think there's definitely a balancing act here between kind of the positives, negatives. Brilliant. Well, we're just going to take a quick pause here. We'll be back very shortly. Here at 11FS, we believe in explaining FS without the BS. That's why we created our 11FS Explores series, videos that break down a complicated financial services topic into something everyone can get their head around, such as
non-fungible tokens,
buy now, pay later, the cost of living,
ESG,
circular economies,
embedded finance,
and inclusive design.
Search 11FS Explores on YouTube now. Okay, let's now move on and look at how things might change in the digital nomad world and the services supporting that, how they might change as well. So with workplaces becoming more populated again and the current economic downturn, what's the thoughts in this group? Do we think we're going to see an increase or a decrease in the number of digital nomads going forward? Devin, what do you reckon?
I think our initial instinct is that I think whilst the pandemic and a shift in technology and remote work was a catalyst for digital nomads over the last few years, I think there will be a pushback on that, partly because migration laws, partly because of taxation, and partly because of the move or shift away from and the economic climate that we currently find ourselves in. I think whilst people are trying to set up businesses, and some of the most successful businesses have been set up during a recession, I think it's also people looking to go necessarily, some people are naturally looking at going back and working for a more mainstay corporate. And I think we're seeing that in some job trends that we've viewed. So in our view, I think the accelerated rise of digital nomads will probably, in our view, curtail. Doesn't mean it's not going to that over time grow, but I think it's certainly over the next few years, for the reasons I've outlined, the growth will curtail. Whether that retrenches, I think it's just too early to say.
Diamantis, what's your perspective? What do you see from where you are?
I think that in general, mass layoffs that we're seeing, and we're just seeing the very beginning of it, I think will move people away from false security of corporate, because there is no security in corporate. We can see that. Your company can be bought by Musk and you're laid off. And it's not just Twitter. I've seen a lot of my good friends who spent 10, 15 years in a corporate doing very well, especially in contracting sectors that are losing to the new industry. They're being let go, and those people probably will never go back to the old, because that loyalty is gone. So a lot of these people, I know, they're either going for sort of a part-time, working where they want to get that flexibility back, and they maybe have some money. Maybe they'll go into startups, maybe they will go into co-founding. So any point at which we will seeing this sort of point of distress and uncertainty, they will have more people going for alternatives, I would say. So I would be more on the growth end of this, and people will choose lifestyle more and more, I would say, especially as my generation, the millennials, are coming into play big time. For us, that loyalty is way less and less. So yeah, I'm quite bullish about the future, and it makes sense, right? I think for a long period of time, we have deprioritized sun in our decision-making process when we choose our careers, when we choose where we live. A lot of my friends who have been in London, well, because it's the best place to live, because it's the best opportunity. And this is becoming probably not such a big factor anymore when you can earn London salaries and work from Bali or anywhere else. So I think people are starting to value that more and more, especially in the affluent segment, for sure.
Yeah, no, Bali are rolling out their new visas as well, aren't they? So trying to reel those people in. Obviously, yeah, Chris, we've got a bit of a split opinion here. You get the casting vote. Is this a fad or is this here to stay?
Oh, casting vote. I like that. I think there's, call me biased, right? Because my business is in this space. But no, genuinely, I think that there's a valid point from both sides here. I think Devin's probably right in saying that things aren't going to keep going to the moon in the same way that they did over the last couple of years. But I don't think that things will stop. Like there's it'll probably continue it might go back to like the bubbling away phase where it slowly grows. But I don't think that it's going away. I think if you fast forward 5 or 10 years, there's probably going to be this huge divergence where there'll be companies who chose to adapt and grow and at least either take a hybrid approach, and companies who didn't. And it'll be like going back to the early noughties where it's like, hey, are you going to be on social media or are you not going to be on social media? And then, all of the companies who chose social media are still here, and we've all forgotten about the ones who didn't choose social media. So yeah, I think maybe it's going that kind of way, and that's my casting vote. And let's loop back in 10 years and see what actually happened.
Yeah, well, we'll have to check back in. I like that you declared your bias up front there. At least we've got that.
Own it.
Devin, I mean, do you think we're going to see, if this trend either accelerates or plateaus, regardless, there is still a sizable community of these individuals globally that needs to be solved for. Do you think we're going to see a bank emerge specifically focused on this digital nomads group?
I mean, I think you're seeing the rise anyway of fragmented, what we call fragmented community banking. So people are trying to create banks for communities, or particularly communities which are perceived as disadvantaged or are not having the financial services being easily provided to them. And that can be religious communities like the Muslim community. It can be gender, because women in investing is a big focus, right? Why were women not investing as much? So why don't we create an investment and banking platform for them? The same can be said. I mean, Monet's was about the migrant worker, and I think digital nomads is something which I think is possible. I do think the unit economics on a bank just for a community has pitfalls, because you need to be able to not only analyze the retention on that, but also the practicalities of some of the challenges we've talked about, payments and tax and other aspects associated with that. So whilst I think it's conceivably possible, I think it needs to be thought through on a lot of these issues. And I think we're no longer in a venture capital world where there's huge amounts of fuel to go and build your business and think about unit economics later. I think it has to be front and center how a business like that is going to become profitable quite quickly.
Yeah, I think we definitely seem to be moving much more into an environment of having to prove, create that initial offering, prove that there's a business case behind that, and then sort of build in increments and go out into other areas in increments. Demantis, everyone gets very excited about super apps, and for sometimes with good reason, sometimes with not such good reason. But to me, this seems like an interesting audience in the sense that the types of challenges that we've talked about do genuinely go across lots and lots of different categories, across finances, but also lifestyle choices and accommodation. Do you think there's a case for a super app here? Could transfer expand over time to become the super app for digital nomads?
I actually think that it's going to be companies that are moving upwards that will be the winners here. I don't think you need a new brand to service this segment. But the reality today in Europe, for example, super app is not a thing, even though a lot of people talk about super apps. But if you go deeper into their financials, it's still either FX, which is currency and payments, or it's crypto, or was crypto. That's as much as super appy as we get these days. Everybody wants to be in there, but there's very little innovation when it comes to new products. A lot of people are just throwing things at the wall and see what sticks, but it actually doesn't drive CLV per customer. That's what we see. But I think, generally speaking, the digital bank will be much more monopolized place than traditional bank, because you won't need that many digital players, because what we see already is that a pure banking model, when it comes to paying per account, has largely failed. There's very few profitable or good companies that were able to build up in that way. Most of them are either in payments, FX, and they're using banking as an entry point. So I think that the best companies will emerge, the ones that will be able to scale beyond payments. because payments will soon going to be a commodity, instant, very low cost. That's happening. We haven't scaled it to everybody, but the next chapter of winners and those super apps will be the ones that will solve these structural problems around credit, around access, and around, delivering identities to people that don't have identities, that they could get access to various financial products. Because right now we don't have a problem of having a lot of different products out there, but most of customers globally, especially the economic migrant and probably nomads as well, because they're in another country, just are not eligible. So for example, a Ukrainian migrant in Europe is not able to access Robinhood trading for only reason that they fall outside of their risk profile. But this is a problem of identity. This is the problem of transferable identity across the web rather than actual problem with specific demographics, right? So I think we need to solve structural problems like the similar thing we had to do in payments. Like we are in payments for a decade. Now 80% of our transactions are instant 24/7 and for like 3% of the cost of traditionals. But we did that not through blockchain, not through, a lot of it, but actually by building within the traditional system and building our own clearinghouse on top. I think similar stories will happen when innovation will happen and transform how we look at identity, transform how we look at cross-border credit. And those will be those actual super apps in Europe that will have multiple revenue streams that are big as FX. So I think it's going to be a different flavor of what we see in WeChat, for example, which is a government-supported super app, which is never going to be a market in Europe. So they will be, but they will require some significant innovation, I would say.
Devin, obviously you touched on fiat earlier on, and Demantis has talked about the scale of structural change that's needed, whether that sits in the traditional fiat ecosystem or the crypto world, I guess is something that a lot of people are interested in. Do you think the crypto industry will move in if the traditional fiat and infrastructure doesn't go through some of the changes that Demantis has outlined?
I think we're quite bearish on where the crypto world is, and for obvious reasons. Right now, I think the crypto world needs to look inside itself a little bit more before it starts trying to solve other problems, in our view. That may sound quite harsh, but I think there's a lot of cleaning up needing to be done. I think we're probably being a bit harsh on how financial services is generally serving this community. I think, given where it was 10 years ago, and we always have to look at things in, I think, schemes of 5 years, not in 1 year, or 5 or 10 years. I think we've come a long, long way. I think the question is, there are certain bits which need to be corrected, and some things, whichever way you look at it, are out of the hands of builders or venture capitalists, even, like tax. And so these are things which will take time to find the best possible seamless, frictionless route to solve. So I don't think crypto is the answer, to be honest, for digital nomads. I don't think it helps solve some of the problems that we've talked about. It may provide a short-term solution, but then if you're being paid in digital cash, particularly, you're also opening yourselves up to a whole wave of volatility in different area. I
like the balance of pragmatism and criticism. Let's be pragmatic about what's improved and optimistic about what needs to change. So, sadly, we're getting to the end of the show, but just to round us out, I suppose if we could use that, what one thing do we think has changed for the better? What's better now than it was 5 years ago in the financial services world for digital nomads? And what one thing do you think really, really needs to change? I'd love to get your perspective on that. So yeah, Demantis, what one thing's better and what one thing still needs to improve?
Western Union and MoneyGram no longer tax people on cross-border payments, that's for sure. We should be very, very happy about that. Even though cash is not dying as quickly as we would like, that they're in deep trouble. So that's good. 10 years ago, I had to convince every single VC that they will not react. So it's good to be, at least for once, right? And there's a lot of good companies that have made that happen. Now, what still needs to happen is identity. Global identity, like we have HTTPS protocol for internet, we need that protocol for identity. So it's transferable, interoperable across different, and it's I think governments needs to step in because it needs to be a global standard that's recognized, like an NGO or something like that. But I think that's something that we don't talk enough about because that's going to be a main and a huge enabler for anyone, nomads, migrants, anyone who wants to leverage their identity and have it transferable.
Chris, what do you reckon? One thing that's improved, one thing that still needs to be fixed?
I think banking in general has improved. Or if we think about this in schemes of, in the 5-year view or the 10-year view, like the rise of neobanks and just like mobile banking and how that's changed and how that's evolved over the years is great. Obviously, a lot of work to do, but if we look back 5 years, I think that's a big win. One thing that still needs to be improved, this touches on what you've just said, Demantis, which is like countries recognizing that global mobility is something that needs to be tackled and kind of pulling their weight a little bit on everything else. Like a lot of the makers and the builders and the technology world are there and want to build this stuff and want to bring it to market, or that's how I feel. But I think that governments or governing bodies kind of keeping a lid on it without really realizing it, but they're just a lot slower to adapt and to welcome this kind of stuff.
And Devin, lastly on you, what one thing that's good, one thing that needs to change?
If I were to boil it down, I'd say democratization and access of financial services. Someone can move from one country in Europe to another and open a bank account in a matter of minutes. That's fantastic. That couldn't happen a few years ago. I think in terms of what can be improved, I think a greater standard. We talked about identity, standardization of identity, and standardization and standard interpretation of law. Employment law, labor law. I think these things would be tax law would be great, would make life easier for this sector. And I think if we can get certainly within certain countries, whether it doesn't have to be across regions, even like the whole EU, but Benelux or certain countries where there is like migration between areas, greater harmonization, I think that would be very helpful.
For sure. Fingers crossed. Well, sadly, we've run out of time, so that wraps up today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you and the companies that you represent, Chris?
So I am probably most accessible on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Chris Cerra. Or if you want to come and get some fantastic accommodation deals, you can sign up to the newsletter, remotebase.co. And if you hit reply to any of those emails, you basically land directly in my inbox. So that's the fastest route to me.
Awesome. Devin, what about you?
Like Chris, LinkedIn, Outward VC LinkedIn page, or even if easier, our webpage, outwardvc.com.
Brilliant. And Demantis, what about you?
Well, if you go to transfergo.com, you can now find the best FX deal from £10 to 100,000. If it's not, ping me on LinkedIn. I will make sure you guys get it, especially if you come with the show. So if you've seen us here, let me know. I will make it happen. Joking aside, I'm on LinkedIn. You respond fairly quickly. Happy to connect.
Brilliant. And you can find me also on LinkedIn at Kate Moody and on Twitter at k8.moody. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to our podcast and don't forget to leave us a review. It helps us to make it better and helps others to find the show. As always, if you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider or email podcasts@11fs.com. Thank you very much. Goodbye.